Hello, everybody. Good afternoon for those in Central Canada and on the East Coast, and still a good morning to those joining us from the West Coast. Welcome to the ninth event in the New Economy series, a partnership between the Canada School of Public Service and the Centre for International Governance Innovation, otherwise known as CG. My name is Owen Ripley, and I lead the team at the Department of Canadian Heritage, responsible for broadcasting, copyright, and the creative marketplace. And it's my pleasure to be your moderator and to guide today's conversation with this great panel. At the outset, I would like to take some time to acknowledge that I am joining you from the National Capital Region, which is on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Among other things, we do this land acknowledgement to show respect for and be more inclusive of First Nations who have a long history with this land. And on that note, I'd also be remiss that if I didn't acknowledge that a year ago today, George Floyd was killed by a police officer, thrusting the Black Lives Matter movement much more into the public consciousness. And since then, organizations and institutions and society have grappled with hard questions related to systemic racism. And the public service is no exception from that. For those of you who may have interacted with me, you know that I'm a passionate believer in the role and mandate of the public service. But I also know that it risks losing credibility over time unless it better reflects the Canadians it serves. Canadians deserve a public service that is more inclusive of Black people, of Indigenous peoples, of people of color, of persons with disabilities. And today, we should just take a moment to remember that it's incumbent on all of us as public servants to help build that. Turning now to the event at hand, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items. The first one is that simultaneous translation is available in the language of your choice through the portal. You should have received instructions that were sent with you with your webcast link. Donc, la traduction simultanée est offerte dans la langue de votre choix par l'entremise du portail, des directives à cet effet, de même que le texte exposé d'aujourd'hui vous ont été envoyés en même temps que le lien vers la web diffusion. I'd also like to note that we hope that today's panel discussion will be interactive. We'd like you to get involved and to submit your questions. While we have a long list of questions that we'd like to put to the panel, it will be better if you participate. So I'd really invite you, as a question occurs to you, to use the Q&A function of Zoom and to submit your question, and we'll do our best to hit as many of those questions as we can. So you can do that by just clicking on the option in your Zoom interface there. So as I mentioned, I lead the team at Canadian Heritage that's grappling with a number of digital policy issues in the space of broadcasting, in the space of online harms, in the space of news media remuneration. And I've had the opportunity to hear all of our panelists today in one forum or another, or to have interacted with them. And we really have a great lineup of experts to shed some insight on this phenomenon called the attention economy. So for some of you, you may spend a lot of your time thinking about the attention economy. You may be involved in a policy area that's implicated by it, and for some of you, you may be here today just to learn a little bit more about it. today's panelists will, regardless of where you're coming from, I know do great service in terms of shedding some insight. So we have Heidi Torek, who is an associate professor of public policy and international history at the University of British Columbia. She is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, or CIGI, a non-resident fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, a non-resident fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and co-editor of the Journal of Global History. Heidi is an expert on platform governance, the history of media technologies, and health communications. We have Samantha Bradshaw, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University, where she contributes to the work of the Internet Observatory and the Digital Civil Society Lab. She also is a senior fellow at CG and an active contributor to international expert panels, particularly concerning the effects of technology on democracy. Samantha is an expert on producers and drivers of information and how technology enhances and constrains the spread of disinformation online. And finally, but not least, we have Bob Fay, who is the managing director of the digital economy at CG, where his research focuses on complex global governance issues arising from digital technologies. He has held senior roles at the Bank of Canada, including serving as deputy director of the International Department and as special assistant to the Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney. So once again, welcome to all three panelists. We agreed amongst us that each panelist would just take a few minutes at the outset, not to give a long speech, but to spend 3 or 4 minutes just providing some opening remarks and shedding a little bit of light to get us started on this phenomenon of the attention economy. So Bob, I think you're kicking us off.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Owen. And it's great to be here and to be on this panel with Sam and Heidi, who really are the experts. And I've learned a lot from them. And I've learned a lot from what the Canadian government and what our public service is doing in this area. So I thought I would start by just describing what we mean by the attention economy. I was just talking to my wife and one of my daughters, and they go, "What does that mean?" Because from a parent's perspective, when kids get onto the internet, it's the inattention economy. They don't want to listen to us. But of course, the reason why is because when they're on, there's a lot of things on these websites that they keep their attention and our attention more generally. Because we go online to find information and to link with our friends and do a whole bunch of things. But when we do that, and some of you may be aware of what's going on behind the scenes, but I'll describe it anyway. But essentially, we're bartering with our personal data to get a service. And each time we go onto a website or an app, we continually give up data. Sometimes we knowingly do it, and sometimes we have no idea it's happening because of opaque terms of agreements and things like that. But the implications of what we're doing when we're engaging in this attention economy, I think, are much broader than that simple barter. So first, there's this ad tech model that runs in the background. And so when you enter a website, the information that is available to Google, let's say, is essentially auctioned off. And this auction takes place as you're loading a website. And the information about you will be released to advertisers who will decide how much they want to pay based on the amount of information they have about you, because the more that they have or available to them, likely the more successful they will be in the ad. So this all takes place until you load the website. When you've loaded the website, the ad is in place, or it's not, depending on how the auction went. And of course, just imagine this taking place billions and billions of times a day. As an economist, this thing is incredibly impressive. But as an individual, as a citizen, it can actually be pretty scary. And Alphabet and Facebook make billions and billions of dollars off of their advertising. So this attention economy is literally worth a fortune. And then websites use a lot of techniques to keep you on the website. They're called dark patterns, and you can look them up. but they do they do other things too. So I went into the Google privacy settings to find out what was tracking me, and eventually, if you do that, you'll find out. Like for my case, I think I had 200 companies tracking me. Never heard of any of them. Don't recall agreeing to any of them to see my data. And every single one of them says they're there to help me do something better. Well, that's really nice, but I certainly didn't know about that. So, there's a lot of questions that arise. Like, do you know what data have been collected about you? Do you know what it says about you or what it says about other people? In the case of our kids, do we really know what our kids are being targeted with and what data they are giving up? There was a survey that says that I'm looking at my screen here that kids get an ad once every 10 seconds when they're online. So just think of that. Just think how many ads they're getting over the course of a session. Anyway, all of this data creates what we call a data value chain. And the data, it feeds into the algorithms, and then those algorithms are used by platforms to do something. So what are all the issues that could arise? Well, obviously, there's a whole bunch of issues related to the consent and control of the data, how the data are used, to the issues around algorithms, and you heard about bias in algorithms. Well, bias in algorithms could be bias in algorithms, or it could be bias from the data that enters the algorithms, and a whole bunch of other things. And something that I know Owen probably deals with certainly much more than me, but the concerns about how private actors are using our personal data. There's so much concern about Big Brother and how the government may use our data. And it's only until recently that people have started to say, but what about those social media platforms? Like, how are they using our data? And the issues are very, very broad. And I'll finish with this. So, and they truly are profound. They're global in nature. They're things like democratic integrity, genocide, radicalization, surveillance capitalism, fake news, myths and disinformation that can create public safety and public health risks. There's what's called effective AI and how algorithms can be used to nudge our behavior. There's a whole bunch of competition issues related to some of these technologies. And of course, what makes it even more difficult for a policymaker is that all of these areas are interrelated. So I'll stop there for my opening salvo.
Thanks, Bob. Not a small order of things to tackle at all. So I think we're going to Sam next to pick up that thread.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for that kind of overview of, the data that really powers the attention economy. I like the analogy of the attention economy and these social media platforms as being, contemporary empires, but they're empires of our minds. That's something that's always kind of really stuck with me, and it's a kind of a good way of framing it. And the data that you've described is really like what they use to fuel the building and expansion of these empires. I wanted to focus my remarks a little bit not just on like the data and the stuff behind it, but also particularly on the algorithms and the big kind of systemic structures in place that will nudge, persuade, direct users towards certain kinds of information. A lot of my work really centers around disinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories, and how this kind of content can spread online, and particularly how social media platforms, through their technologies, might enhance or constrain the spread of certain kinds of harmful information. I think one big part of the attention economy has a lot to do with the algorithms and the ways that they'll nudge users towards certain kinds of content. When we think about algorithms and the way that they're designed to keep us hooked and keep us connected, they'll, like Bob described very, very well, personalize content and tailor content to us so that it's stuff that we already like, that we'll find engaging, that we'll want to look at. But the kind of content that tends to also go viral the things that people tend to look at, it tends to be content that's much more negative, content that makes us afraid, content that makes us angry. And of course, there's content that makes us happy too, that will go viral. That's why we see cat memes and cute dog videos, or Charlie bit my finger going viral, although I heard that that video was recently sold, so it's not going to be on the internet anymore. Whole other interesting issue. But back to the point, content that is very emotive and that tends to elicit negative emotions tends to go much further and much farther, because part of it is human nature. It's the stuff that we like. People like conspiracy, we like rumor, we like to gossip and chit chat, but at the same time, algorithms reinforce a lot of those kinds of emotions because they're the things that get people typing, that get people engaged and using the platforms. And the more time we spend on these platforms, looking, scrolling, chatting, liking, typing, commenting, getting outraged, the more advertisements that will be delivered to us. And so there's this tension here with the business model where the kinds of content that tend to go viral and keep us on are not necessarily good for us personally, and they're probably not necessarily good for our democracy and for finding common ground and negotiating consensus with one another. So I think I'll leave my opening remarks there, but I'm looking forward to more discussion with my panelists.
Thanks, Sam. Let's turn to Heidi.
Yeah, thanks so much. So Bob and Sam have laid this out very well for me. So I'm going to start by putting on my historian hat and say that what we're confronting here is, I think, a whole host of old fears about new technologies embedded in new realities. So for example, I teach a course on the history of news, and I always show my students a whole newspaper from 1900, where most of it is comprised of reports about grisly deaths, weddings of people who met in parks. So if we think about the stuff that goes viral, that basically describes, the commercialization of newspapers in the late 19th century. And we find parliamentarians and others also concerned about the way that information going to the masses will create all sorts of protests and problems, and how information needs to be controlled in different kinds of ways. So I'd say lots of these fears that we have are old. Even the instructions about what we should put out to go viral are old. You can find in a manual of 1930 an instruction that cats are cuter than dogs. So you should put more cat photos in newspapers. So even the idea that cat memes are better than dog memes, something I fundamentally disagree with as a dog lover. Those are also things that are actually quite old. And yet these fears, I think, are embedded in fundamentally new realities in a couple of different ways. One is the strength of these companies that don't simply talk about content, right? They are doing all sorts of other things that are tracking you in different kinds of ways, and their sheer scale and power, right? That the major companies, the top 5 major companies, are worth more than the entire DAX index of German companies, is on a scale that we don't see in the past. Another aspect of this is the algorithmic aspect that is so micro-targeted. And I want to emphasize that sometimes has really terrible consequences that go beyond what Bob and Sam have mentioned, and that includes things that are really psychologically harmful. For example, women who have had a miscarriage and previously were searching around pregnancy will continue to have ads around pregnancy and babies delivered to them. Only recently, actually, this was the first year where some social media companies allowed people to opt out of receiving notifications around Mother's Day, because of course, for some people, if you've lost your mother or all sorts of other circumstances, you're estranged, being continually notified of Mother's Day is actually something that can be quite psychologically harmful. So I think even beyond just thinking about the attention economy, the fears for democracy, there's also the ways in which this can psychologically harm individuals, because we simply don't have the option to opt out of some of these aspects of tracking. That only now is being discussed after actually quite a lot of campaigning and awareness raising. The other aspect of this that I would want to bring up is this question of the lack of choice. What we actually see is that when people do have a choice, they don't want to be tracked this much. Many of you might have read in the newspapers about the fight around Apple's updates around privacy, which are allowing people now to approach this in a different way. So rather than having to actively opt out, you now have to actively opt in to be tracked. And what we know so far is it seems like only 4% of people are actively opting in to be tracked. So that tells us that a whole system was constructed on something that 96% of Apple users didn't want. That I think should give us pause if we think around the way in which this entire attention economy was constructed. And I'll end with just one final thing, just to pop up two words that I think were implicit in what Bob and Sam were saying. One is that this is an ecosystemic problem. It encompasses all of the different nouns that Bob listed. That makes it really tough. And the second aspect is that it is indeed global in all sorts of ways, which also make it very difficult, because if we think about what national solutions work, we're also confronting global platforms. Obviously, we often mention Facebook, Google, etc., but there are also platforms like TikTok, for example. So we're not also confronting something where all of these platforms have their headquarters in the United States. Some of them also do in China and also elsewhere. So how we solve ecosystemic and global problems are real challenges that we have to confront, and I think ones where we have to bring together interdisciplinary groups like this, but also where we have to bring in voices, for example, from the global south, who often can tell us what are the harms that have been rendered by these platforms years before they arrive on the shores of North America or Europe. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Heidi and Sam and Bob. So I already have a number of questions, but maybe Heidi, I'll pick up on the point about iPhone users. I'm an iPhone user, so I've started getting the notification about this app wants to track you. Do you want to allow it, or do you not want you to allow it? And really giving the user the ability to make that choice. But I guess it raises the question. Bob started at the outset talking about kind of the economics, so to speak, of the attention economy, right? And so I guess your thoughts on kind of the ripple effect of that, like what begins to happen to the model if suddenly your data is not necessarily paying for the service that you've been used to getting for free.
Yeah, so I think there are a whole host of questions that arise from that. One is, how effective was micro-targeting really versus kind of broad category-based advertising? That's number one, because the companies say it's really effective, but some academic studies suggest it's not that much more effective than other types of advertising. So I guess we might see answers to that. But the second is that we don't really know as outsiders how effective some of these advertising techniques are, right? So I think that's one element, is how far is this a company selling to advertisers, micro-targeting is brilliant and it's going to, up the number of conversions, and how far is that not necessarily true? So, we shall see that, I think, unfold. The other aspect of this, I think, that's really crucial is the question of how far micro-targeting may or may not have been violating laws around discrimination. So we know from investigations, for example, out of the Markup, which is a fantastic media outlet that I'd suggest you follow if you're interested in these sorts of things. We know from the Markup that actually lots of advertisements, for example, around housing on Facebook were actually contravening the HUD's, the Housing and Urban Development Department in the United States government's guidelines on housing, for example, using zip codes as a proxy for race. So this is, I think, another really crucial aspect of this, thinking in Canada as well. How far was micro-targeting used, perhaps not intentionally, in ways that are actually discriminatory and illegal? So that's, I think, another question it opens up. And then the final aspect of that is, how do we solve all these questions? Well, we need some transparency. And we know that the companies don't reveal huge amounts of their data for secret source reasons, etc. But perhaps also because they themselves are not investigating it. Something that I've called, and others have, agnotology, or a love of ignorance. So companies say they're tracking you, they've got all sorts of information, but when we actually dig into what questions they look at, we know that there are some questions they do not investigate. For example, that somebody who was working for YouTube was explicitly told not to investigate whether algorithms were pulling people into far-right rabbit holes. So transparency, I think, is one way through regulators that we can at least start to solve some of these questions, because I honestly can't give you a straight answer as to what these changes will entail.
Thanks, Heidi. Bob or Samantha, either of you want to jump in on that one?
Oh, why don't you go? You go first, Sam.
Sure. Yeah, no, Heidi, I think those are like super great questions. And, even when we're thinking about like regulatory responses to those questions around micro-targeting and putting limits and restrictions on that, because, I think when we're thinking like elections, we can kind of pull like broad demographic information about people, and that kind of broad advertising could still work as part of the business model. But when we get down to my very specific interests, that this that I like yoga and eat avocado toast, and these kinds of factors about me go into the advertisings that I see, I think that's really when people start to become very uncomfortable with this technology. And so thinking more strategically about regulating privacy there, and like addressing this micro-targeting issue, I think is super important. And as a researcher and an academic in this space, the calls for transparency and for more data and for more insight into the ways that algorithms are tailoring and personalizing or nudging people towards certain kinds of content over others. Like, I think this is a super important question because, like you said, right now, we just don't actually know. We can't actually measure the true harms of these technologies. We can't disentangle the technological problem from other problems that we're seeing within society and our information ecosystems without having access to this kind of data that's so held tightly by the various platforms. Like one of the biggest questions is, do certain kinds of users get pushed towards more extreme content than others? And we just don't know that because we can't audit the algorithms from this kind of personal standpoint, because what I see on my YouTube reel is going to be different than everybody here. And so maybe I, as a person, would be more likely to be pushed down one of these rabbit holes compared to others. We have no way of like measuring this and looking at these kinds of trends across a whole society level without more insight, more data, more transparency into the platforms.
Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Heidi and Samantha just said. I was thinking when Heidi was talking, I worked on a project, I think 20 years ago at the OECD. And it was, you start with the question that you want to answer and then you figure out the data. And it was about how do you create statistical models to figure out who's going to become long-term unemployed before that happens, because it's extremely harmful for individuals and society at large when people become long-term unemployed. And so the US had started up some work in this area. They called it profiling. And some of the questions that we addressed 20 years ago are just as relevant today. So you should, in terms of the statistical models, you could not use age, you could not use gender, you could not use race, because that would violate the law in the United States. So that all seems good. Well, what do? You do what Heidi had mentioned. You find variables that are correlated. And that's pretty easy to find, like educational attainment will tell you a lot. So a lot of the questions we're dealing with today, I find, are ones that have been around for a long time, but we still haven't gotten our handle on how to address them. And so there's this really interesting project that's been started up by something called the GovLab, working with the OECD and others, called the 100 Questions. And it's got 5 different areas. And what are the questions that we need answered? And then from those questions, what are the data that we need? And that's where the transparency comes from, like to guide the transparency, and it guides the metrics as well. And so at CG, we've started up something called the Global Platform Governance Network, where we're looking at these issues right now. And there's many colleagues in the Canadian government that are participating in this network. It is a global network of civil servants and legislative staff and regulators that come together to discuss what are countries doing in the area of social media platform governance, which can be quite broad. And when we heard the types of questions that were being asked in this forum, we came up with 3 working groups. And as I said, one's on transparency, one's on metrics, and then one's on how do governments actually do research to try and understand these questions. And I can go into that later on, but I'll point the listeners today to that. And if people in the government want to participate, there's space for them.
Thanks, Bob, and colleagues. So just a reminder to folks listening, you are welcome to submit your own questions if you like. There's a little hand icon, I think, in the corner of your screen, and then you have an option to either insert a question or upvote, I think, an existing question. So just to remind you about that. I guess I wanted to pick up on, you, Sam and Heidi. I think you both spoke about kind of the need for additional transparency in this space, along with privacy regulation. And, so sitting on the side of government, I think one of the criticisms we frequently face is that, government has a tendency to approach problems kind of based on their existing kind of organizational structures and kind of where something sits in the government portfolio, right? So, and partly that reflects kind of the incremental nature of public policy making, but it obviously also just kind of reflects existing structures. So I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts on, is there a country out there that's on the right track for dealing with some of these issues that are obviously very more horizontal in nature, and how governments kind of pivot to dealing, connecting, I guess, all the dots that are related to this issue. Why don't you lead us off,
I can go first,
Heidi?
if you want.
Yeah.
So I think that's the point of looking at this globally, because I'm not sure any one country has solved it or will ever solve it. It's more a question of how do we approach it in a way that we'll be able to deal with upcoming challenges, right? So one, basic example is a place like Taiwan that actually has a digital minister. So that already helps you in sort of having portfolio as somebody who's really thinking about these digital questions along a whole host of different places. And the digital minister, Audrey Tang, and you can watch an interview with them actually on the CG website, is really thinking about this from a whole host of different perspectives, including actually personal experience in building and making transparent maps and all sorts of stuff. So I think, South Korea is another place to look at. There's definitely lots of things where they struggle equally, things like hate speech, misogynist abuse, the ways that AI can run amok and become very quickly abusive, and chatbots. These are all questions that, for example, South Korea is grappling with, but also in the context of a much more digitized society. So I guess my basic point would be there's no one country that I would point to as having, quote unquote, solve this, but we see some where they've created new portfolios and really tried to coordinate across different ministries. And that in turn, I think, really played out when you had things like COVID-19 break out, because they were able to really take advantage of digital connectivity swiftly and put out rapid government guidelines on a whole host of different channels by working together in a way that most European and North American governments frankly struggle to do. So I think there's a lot to learn, I would say, from other governments there.
I think there's a lot to learn as well in terms of when governments have introduced policies or measures that haven't worked or that have had a lot of negative or unintended consequences. And in particular, like designing new laws that tackle content only and going and dealing with a lot of the issues of the attention economy at this highly visible level of content, rather than looking at some of the systemic structures as to why this content goes viral in the first place, is solutions that I don't think work very well and have a lot of unintended consequences. We often see laws being introduced to target disinformation or fake news or COVID-19 conspiracies being introduced, but then being used as a tool to repress freedom of speech, to repress any kind of political opposition, to attack freedom of the press. And so there is kind of this flip side to the crisis that we're currently seeing with social media and the attention economy, and a lot of these questions around content and democracy and speech, where governments are using this as an opportunity to further exercise censorship and further exercise repression on their own populations.
So I guess it kind of begs the question, kind of what the appropriate role for government is in this conversation. And I guess your thoughts then, Sam, or others, on kind of what is the appropriate role for regulation, if any, in this space? And if that's not the role of government, then what is? Any takers?
I mean, this is the $1 million question here. I could take a first stab, and then I'd love to hear Bob and Heidi I'd love to hear your thoughts. So for me, I think, first of all, the role of government in terms of pushing for more transparency, like we talked about earlier, and more data access is crucial, because we can't do good policymaking without good data. If we don't understand the problem, any kind of solution that we're going to be proposing could have a lot of these unintended consequences, or it could have a much greater negative effect than doing nothing, if we don't really understand the problem and understand the extent to which harm is coming from these platforms. So for me, I think that's step number one in terms of what governments can do. And then I think there's a bunch of low-hanging fruit in terms of policy responses. So we already talked about privacy and talked about data, and putting limits, restrictions, requirements on the kinds of data that are collected and used about people, and providing a framework that gives users more control and more choice over their information. I think this is kind of one of the more low-hanging fruits in the overall kind of systemic problem, is starting to control user data there. And then, I don't know, I'd like to hear about maybe from Bob or Heidi, like questions around antitrust. This is an area that I know less about, but I know there's a lot of policy making and thinking happening in the space of competition. So yeah, I'll stop there and maybe let you guys take over.
And maybe just to throw, because I guess it also, it's always this balance between, is the answer to the machine the more machine, right? And we see that even with Apple rolling out its feature about being able to stop track. I mean, it's a technological response to this business model that you've commented on. Bob, you talked about you actually are able to go into your Google settings and control your privacy settings, and we all get prompted now to do our privacy checkup and kind of go through that step, right? So I mean, you're seeing these technology companies roll out technological answers to some of these things, and I think it's the question about is that the answer to this, or is there more?
Yeah.
So Bob,
Sorry. Oh, and I was just going to say, that's like a great point too, is that a lot of the regulation and the responses do focus on the technology rather than on other kind of trends. If we're thinking about, the relationship with disinformation and elections and democracy, for example, people tend to focus on the social media companies only. We don't focus on the fact that polarization within society more broadly has been increasing even before we've had smartphones or computers. Decline in trust in governments and institutions has also been growing before computers and the internet. The decline of political parties more broadly has been happening around the world. And so these are bigger systemic trends within our societies that don't necessarily have connections to technology. Technology might certainly enhance or exacerbate some of these problems, but they're also pre-existing problems. And so if we deal with the social media challenge, or this challenge around the attention economy, these other problems aren't going to just disappear and go away. And so as regulators too, we can think more broadly about solutions that don't just involve technology.
Yeah, I'd like to reinforce that point. I mean, there seems to be this tendency to really focus on the technology. And of course, given the name of my institution, governance, with governance in it, we really think the solutions are at the governance level. But easier said than done. So take one of the points that Sam raised on low-hanging fruit and privacy. I mean, I agree. But if you look at Bill C-11 that's going through, well, it seems to have stalled. It's somewhere in the parliamentary process. But one of the questions was, well, why didn't it have a human rights focus? Like, why is Canada not pursuing a human rights focus, whereas that's what the EU has done as the basis of its legislation? So I agree, like it's essential we deal with this, but the way forward, well, I think it's still open for debate. But I think more generally one of the issues that you raise on this horizontal nature of these technologies where they affect all areas, and governments are not set up for that. They're set up to work vertically. Of course, we know that there's a mechanism put in place in the Canadian government and elsewhere to get that horizontal cooperation, but how that disseminates throughout the public service is unclear. And I've had my experience in those areas, and it's very difficult. So so when it comes to priorities, and to pick up on competition, so in our trade agreement with the United States, we have open data flows, and I think economists will say open data flows are what you need to allow to harness the social benefits that can come from aggregated data. So you really want to put minimum restrictions on data flows, whether internally or cross-border, subject to some protections. But the one thing we also know is, going back to something I raised earlier, that the more data that we allow to flow across borders essentially just increases the monopoly power of certain companies that are headquartered in the United States. So there's trade-offs there. And who should make those trade-offs, and how should they be made? Extremely difficult question, and poses a challenge for virtually all areas of policy.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in with some further thoughts. So I agree with all of this, having studied previous technologies and how they were also used to foment political, economic, cultural issues. We should be wary of making this just a technology problem. But I want to throw out a couple of things. One is that, as scholars are pointing out, we sometimes have lost imagination in what the internet could look like and what a public internet could be. So, for example, people have pointed out, the idea of libraries in the late 19th century. That is a form of democratizing knowledge that was public, and yet it seems almost unimaginable that a government would do that in the early 21st century, which is quite strange. So Joan Donovan at the Shorenstein Center said, why don't we just hire 10,000 librarians to help curate the internet as a thought experiment in how the internet could be different? Or Ethan Zuckerman, who's at UMass Amherst, has written a new book that's thinking about things like public infrastructure online. So I'd say that's, one potential thing for government to at least think about. Why are we so constrained in our imagination to think about how we regulate the companies that already exist, instead of thinking, and maybe that's the job of academics, right? To do the big picture, thinking about what could another internet be? But the truth is there are some companies like that, right? For all their flaws, Wikipedia is an imagination of what that internet is, and yet we only ended up with one Wikipedia and not many. How far was that a result of the policy infrastructure that existed, and is there another policy infrastructure that could lead to more Wikipedias rather than more Facebooks? Is I think a question that we should at least take very seriously. So that's a big question. That is not a low-hanging fruit question, but I think it's an important one to not constrain our imaginations. Also because, of course, companies have lobbyists, including in the United States. And when companies lobby for regulation, we just have to always make sure we're a bit skeptical about why they're lobbying for a particular type of regulation and not another. So, for example, is lobbying for a certain type of antitrust or competition legislation actually going to unintentionally lock in the current big players who exist? And we do actually have historical examples of that. So to give you one sort of concretely, just to emphasize that we need to think very carefully about some of these things and bring in these historical examples. So the Associated Press was obviously one of the big news agencies in the US in the first half of the 20th century. But it was actually a closed franchise system where only some other newspapers were allowed to join. And other newspapers said, well, this is anti-competitive and we need to have access into this market. The other news agencies aren't as good, etc. So that in the end led to the US government launching an antitrust case against the Associated Press. Associated Press loses in 1945 and has to open up its franchise to everyone. So you would think, well, this is, a good news story about antitrust. But ironically, what ended up happening is all the other news agencies within 30 years went bust. United Press didn't exist, INS didn't exist, because everybody flocked to the AP. So it's just to say we have to be a bit careful with antitrust to assume that it's always going to lead to more competition in the market. We actually find some historical examples where the opposite occurs, unfortunately. Okay, a couple of low-hanging fruits I think we can think about from the government perspective. One is creating due process in thinking about content moderation. I've suggested eCourts as an example of that to try to get away from the problem that Sam described of how legislation around content has actually led to suppression of speech. But what if we create some online due process around content regulation? A second thing to think about is the role of government in bringing civil society into the mix. So while the Christchurch principles have been talked about a lot, something that was incredibly notable about them was that they only involved government and platforms. Where was the role of civil society initially? That has changed over the course of the last couple of years, but I think we can think about the role of government as also elevating and bringing in marginalized and other voices from civil society who deserve to be heard by platforms, but aren't, and who deserve to have a role in saying how these platforms should develop. So the role of government doesn't always have to be regulation. It can also be lifting up voices and ensuring that they have a stake, that we follow the principle of nothing about us without us. So thinking about the role of government, I guess, very, very expansively is what I would advocate for.
So, you know, we maybe have some folks who are listening to this, and this is all, you know, very interesting, but these ideas and problems seem, you know, super big, right? But you know, my recommender algorithm recommended Social Dilemma to me on Netflix, and I watched it, and you know, I'm really worried about this. So, you know, at a citizen level, though, like what are some concrete things that, you know, folks can do to, you know, either better educate themselves on this, or, you know, just exercise more control over these issues. Any thoughts on that one?
I wonder if I could just maybe not quite answer that first, but go to the going back to governance. And so one of the areas that the Canadian government is actively involved in is standard setting, and through the Standards Council of Canada, but also in something called the CIO Strategy Council, which is Treasury Board and the CIO Strategy Council. And it brings the public and private sectors together to work on standards. And standards are quite interesting because they're things that we don't think about, but they pretty well govern most aspects of our lives in many ways. There's standards over technology, but there's also standard like that allow technologies to talk to each other. So our iPhone can talk to Android phones and things like that. But standards also can be used to put in place values as well, to embed our values. And that's tremendously important when it comes to technology, because we want to make sure our values are respected. And that can be brought into standard setting. But, you know, the Canadian government, so the Canadian government's actively involved in that. And so it's not just the government, it's the private sector and a whole host of private sector institutions that can get involved. We don't want to exclude the private sector. And I think there's a tendency to say we can't talk to the platforms because of the vested interests. I think one of the questions we found in our global platform governance network is, who do you actually want to talk to at the platforms? Is it the policy guys, or is it the tech guys within them? And they may have very different perspectives on, for example, the uses of the technology that they develop. The government has got its directive on the use of automated systems. It's got which is, I'd say, groundbreaking in many respects. There's the algorithmic impact assessment questionnaire, which I think is a really good step on creating mechanisms for responsible use of the technology and venues for people to come back and say, hey, I don't understand this decision the government made. What sort of recourse do I have? So there's a lot of things underway. Once again, it's how do you coordinate all that? And there's the domestic level, and then, as Heidi said, there's the whole international perspective on these things, because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on outside of Canada that directly influences Canada, whether we like it or not. And GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, is a classic example, which people point to as a standard essentially on the control and use of personal data. But as a country like Canada, if our firms want to do business in the EU and use personal data, they have to comply with it. Otherwise, they cannot do business in the EU. Well, all of a sudden in Canada, we have to follow those rules whether we like it or not, and they become a de facto standard, and we had no input into the development of GDPR. Well, I think my perspective would be we should have some input into that. But how do you do it? And at CG, we promoted the concept of what we call a digital stability board, which is essentially a mechanism to get regulators, to policymakers, to standard setters to come together globally, civil society, and have these important discussions.
Thanks, Bob. Sam, I know you've thought about this question a fair bit, like you know, the role of citizens in this, and so you know, any thoughts or words of wisdom for folks who are kind of just struggling to see how an individual kind of internet user, so to speak, fits into the equation?
Yeah, so you know, I think there's a couple things that people can kind of do to help, you know, enhance the integrity of our information ecosystem and also keep themselves exert more control and autonomy over their own kind of data. You know, first of all, just go through all of your privacy settings on your apps. Make sure that they are in line with what you want. And you know, I think it's hard right now because there isn't a lot of choice necessarily. But you know, I've personally like gotten off Facebook, the Facebook platform recently, and WhatsApp. There's like other alternatives that are starting to emerge that are a little bit more privacy forward when it comes to data and stuff. And so, doing a little bit of research, seeing if there are alternative solutions for you, and then deciding, you know, if the trade-off for what you get with your data is worth it or not to keep these services. When it comes to like disinformation and like the spread of other kinds of harmful content online, you know, I think as citizens, we all have a responsibility and a role to play in our democracies and in creating an environment that is conducive to public debate and finding and negotiating that kind of consensus that we need for our democracies to work. Of course, this is incredibly hard in our post-truth era where nobody can even agree on the basic facts. So that's like, it makes it really, really hard, I think, for everyday users to feel like they have some kind of control without just getting, you know, angry, seeing all of the kind of negative content that we see every day online. You know, all of the anger, all of the outrage, all of the fear, all of the rumors and conspiracies that are constantly going viral. A lot of the research in this area is starting to show just don't share content and don't share this kind of content. That's the best thing that users can do from an individual standpoint. It seems to have the most effect in terms of, you know, reducing the spread and the harm of this kind of content. And overall is like the most impactful thing that we can do. But I don't like to put too much focus on the individual as well and what we should be doing as people, because there are huge systemic structures in place that are creating the structures that we have these interactions with and within, and that will, you know, amplify a lot of the negative kind of content already. And so there is, of course, a role for users, but there is a very important, you know, role for social media platforms themselves to play in fixing a lot of the harms that we're starting to realize that are coming from these technologies. You know, a lot of the platform responses have been just labeling information, for example. But to me, that just puts the onus back on the user to be, you know, literate readers of information that they're coming across online, instead of the platforms taking accountability for these systems that are constantly pushing users towards extreme positions or pushing them to share conspiracy and disinformation. And so thinking more strategically about what platforms could do at the systemic level is, I think, really key here, and, you know, a huge part of the solution to the problem that takes also the citizen out of it.
If I can just add something super quickly, which is to underscore this point about the individual user versus the systemic, and I'll give one like concrete example about how hard it is. So, you know, in the EU, there was a whole case around what browsers should be pre-installed on smartphones. Because of course, you know, we all tend to use the thing that's simpler. So if, you know, Google Chrome is pre-installed on your Android, you'll use it. But there are, of course, other browsers which, you know, are more privacy forward, except like Ecosia, DuckDuckGo, whatever. And so this case is about, all right, how far should the default settings offer more choice? So I think that's one thing that we can think about. Of course, we as users, there are almost always alternative services, not always, but often, even for browsers, but you need to have a choice that's relatively simple for people. And I think that Apple opt-in, opt-out example shows us that if there's a role for providing those kind of choices, often people do make the more sort of privacy-oriented choice. But there's a lot of this that is really about ease of use. It is very hard to get off, for example, WhatsApp, because a bunch of your family might only be on WhatsApp, and persuading them all to move to something else can be very difficult unless you have, for example, mandated interoperability between one and another. So that's to say, I think there's a bit of a balance here where the role of government, for example, in figuring out what is a level playing field in terms of default choices can be another way to think about the role of government in these systemic issues that then impact on individual users.
Yeah, no, and I think that's, you know, and one of the questions Heidi kind of alludes to that, right? Like, you know, this conversation is focusing a lot on the negative externalities of these platforms, but, you know, of course, there's all the positive externalities as well, right? That many of these companies are very good at designing products and services that help us, you know, be more efficient, more effective, but, you know, and I think, you know, in that respect, I guess I was going to ask about, like, COVID has been a petri dish in some respects in terms of digital policy interventions, as well as just digital products and services. And, you know, we've seen the economy and government and public health responses all have to shift to being digital. So I, you know, wanted to ask, you know, and I think Heidi, you've done some thinking about this or reflecting on this, like, what have we learned through COVID about, you know, the attention economy, and, you know, how governments have either, you know, navigated that space effectively or not so much.
Yeah, so I did a study last year where we looked at the first 6 months of COVID communications in 9 democracies on 5 different continents. And so we found, you know, that there were governments like Senegal, South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, who used all of the channels available to them incredibly effectively to meet their citizens where they were at, to get government guidelines out fast. Because one thing that we also found is the swifter you got your government guidelines out, the fewer problems you had with conspiracy theories, disinformation, etc. And that was also backed up by other big data studies that found that the swifter governments got out clear guidelines, the fewer people searched online for quack cures like silver or bleach, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see that there are actually really positive things that came out of governments that were savvy enough to use all of these channels in different kinds of ways. You know, that's everything from, you know, using text message systems to having chat bots, to making sure that when you post on social media. Senegal, did you bring in people who are really important in civil society, which in Senegal were imams and priests. So you could see all sorts of positive ways that the governments could use this just to inform people. So I don't mean this in a sort of propagandistic way, like you're selling, you know, Nike shoes or something, but to really use it to tailor that information to meet people where they were at in a forward-thinking kind of way. So that's, I think, some really useful lessons that we could draw in Canada. We've also seen, you know, places like BC rarely use things like social media, which, and you know, there's still been a decent, a decently effective response in BC, but it raises the question of how much more effective could it have been if things like social media and emergency text message systems had been used to their full efficacy, as we saw in some other places. So I think it's basically just a plea to say there are ways that we can use these tools responsibly to inform citizens, meet them where they're at. And then finally, I'll say to use them as two-way communication tools, because I think one of the things we saw in places like South Korea or Taiwan was it wasn't just using this as a broadcast system, it was also trying to understand what questions do people have? What do we need to clarify? How can we improve these sorts of things so that it's actually a more of a two-way conversation? And those are some of the things that one can use social media for, even despite the many potential harms that come with it.
Bob or Sam, any insights stemming from COVID where you've sat?
I think the COVID and coronavirus pandemic has really shed light on some of the real challenges with content moderation on social media. In particular, just the way that anti-vax groups or vaccine hesitant narratives spread online, and really the limits of like platform power to kind of moderate these issues. Because, you know, a lot of the conspiracies, so at my work at Stanford, we have a virality project that is like in real time tracking a lot of the vaccine conspiracy theories that are spreading across social media. And we work in partnership with the platforms and with public health agencies to combat a lot of this rhetoric online. In real time. And, you know, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing that platforms have a hard time actioning against is content that's not falsifiable. It's very easy for platforms to label or take down content that is explicitly false. But as soon as people start using like, oh, I heard from a friend or a friend of mine experienced this, that all of a sudden becomes not falsifiable and is much harder to take action against. Or, you know, asking questions about the vaccine is a clever way to spread a lot of hesitancy and skepticism about its safety without actually making a statement that is falsifiable. And so how platforms take action against this kind of content, it raises, you know, a lot of really interesting and difficult free speech questions. But, you know, for me, like what we've kind of learned about the coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19, is just the real challenges at addressing these issues at the content level.
Yeah, I was going to ask you earlier, Sam, you know, you alluded in your opening remarks, I think, to the Science article from a couple of years ago that just talked about kind of how quickly, you know, falsehood spreads compared to truth, that like we're just, humans are wired to be more attracted to that kind of content, and how that kind of plays into, you know, this model. And I guess, you know, on the one hand, right, like the internet as a distributed network, I mean, that's partly what makes the internet so great, right? And I think, you know, it's the challenge of, you know, so how do you guard against these outcomes? And, you know, we saw obviously after the events in the U.S. Capitol on January 6th that, you know, you saw that social media platforms are capable of, you know, making some of these hard decisions and moderating some of these practices. But at the same time, then you saw the migration of users to just different platforms, right? And I mean, it then raises the question of kind of the whack-a-mole problem. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, and this is for all three of you, you know, is there a platform that you've seen out there, like a case study of a platform being wired differently, right? That is countercultural in terms of how it is wired, that kind of presents kind of this alternate possibility of you know, something else being possible. Have either any of you seen something like that?
So I think, you know, Wikipedia is one example of, you know, a different platform with a different model that just works very well. Like Wikipedia, like of course it still has its challenges, but in terms of like its structure and its governance, it's very effective at keeping a lot of mis and disinformation off of the platform. Reddit is another interesting model where instead of like Reddit has some high level guidelines in terms of what can happen on the platform. So, you know, like high level being like no incitement to violence and no hate speech, that kind of stuff. But then every board has its own kind of set of community moderators who have further rules and moderate the content themselves, depending on the board, the topic, the kinds of people that are involved. And, that's another really interesting model that doesn't get talked about a lot. When we think about the governance of social media platforms, we tend to focus on, Google, Google/YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, kind of like the big three. But there are other models out there that work in various ways and that are more effective and provide more control to users, but also have their own kinds of trade-offs and stuff too.
Hi,
Yeah,
Bob.
I think I would just add to what Sam was saying is that what she basically discussed is the governance. It's not the technology. It was the governance of the technology. And I think that's really what stands out from the examples that she raised. And I think, we do get caught up in the technology because it's cool. It can do all these interesting things, but the governance of those technologies is completely under our control. And I think sometimes we forget that. And sometimes for good reason, because technology moves fast and governance mechanisms tend to move quite slowly. But I think there are ways to speed that up. And they're being used in some sectors of the economy. We can create, structures to allow regulators to test out new things. This is being used in the financial sector. It's being proposed in the UK to have e-sandboxes, they call them, as part of their duty of care responsibilities that they're going to put in place. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and I think the focus has to be on the governance.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say exactly the same two examples as Sam, but also to say, we have to be careful in our expectations of platforms too. So, something like Wikipedia in many ways replicates many of the problems we have in society, overly dominant in terms of male editors, many more articles that are about men, women articles about women getting rejected, including very famously the associate professor woman who actually was awarded a Nobel Prize, but had been rejected for a Wikipedia page multiple times. So I think, it's a good example of how you can have excellent governance structures, but you can't necessarily expect that an internet company may be outside of other social and cultural forces. And I know that, of course, Wikipedia is working very hard to change this in all sorts of different ways. A couple of things to say. One is that I think this points us to the way in which scale makes it hard to solve any of these problems. So one of the reasons why Reddit still vaguely has a handle on this is they only do English language. Where does Facebook get in trouble? When you start opening up in places where you have zero content moderators in a language, whether that was in Myanmar or also in Ethiopia, where they're just pulling in some people in Amharic, but nobody, as far as I know, working in Oromo, which is one of the major languages spoken in Ethiopia. So I think that's another thing to bear in mind, is that there's a conflict sometimes between scalability and the ability to govern. And often what we see is that platforms start to get out of control when they go big, right? Because they don't have enough infrastructure in place to be able to deal with these kinds of questions. And we've just talked about this from the content perspective, but you could move on to thinking about, fraud and Mechanical Turk on Amazon. Like, it's almost any of these, the minute you get to a very, very large scale, you start to have a lot of problems that are potentially unexpected. So I think that's another way to think about this. One, how far can platforms escape from or undo more dominant social forces? It turns out that's hard. And two, what does scalability do to all of these questions?
So you started, Heidi, by saying that this is, these are old problems, right? But or old fears embedded in new technologies. And I guess, I think I agree with that, right? But I think that scale problem is really the huge challenge, right? Like that, the power of these companies, like, while the fears may be old, right? Like, we've never before been in a moment of time where a message or piece of content can have such a powerful distribution within hours, right? And I think that's that's really the the challenge. So I guess, being a historian, have there been other moments in history where you've kind of seen a public policy response that we can look to? I mean, I think all three of you alluded to antitrust. Like, is that is that the response that you would point to if you're looking to like a previous historical example of kind of how you deal with the problem of scale?
Yeah, there's many different, depending on the problem we want to solve, there's a different history that we can, I guess, learn from in some way, a usable history. But I do want to correct one thing, which is the idea that this is the first time that we've had things go so fast and we've never dealt with this before. Because actually, in a weird way, things were much faster in the early 20th century. So, I have one example that I look at in the book behind me, News from Germany, which is the actually completely false statement that the Kaiser of Germany had abdicated on the 9th of November, 1918. And I traced minute by minute how long did it take from the announcement to get onto the streets, and it took 10 to 15 minutes. Because by the time you have, newspapers would print extras, it would go via telegraphy. So, it was really that cities were very, very closely intertwined. And actually, in a weird way, because you had newspaper boys who would run around the streets screaming things like, extra, extra, read all about it, this is what has happened. That was not so far off from, a couple of minutes on Twitter. And you couldn't really escape it if you were sitting inside a building and you heard someone shouting outside. In a weird way, you couldn't escape it in a way that you could actually turn off your phone. So even, these accelerated timescales are less clear, right? And I think it also points us to the fact that these things are disjointed. So what I'm describing is a world where that was true for people living in cities. It absolutely wasn't true for people living outside of major cities. And so too today, yes, many people are connected to the internet, but lots of people, billions, are still disconnected, or they're only connected via, for example, something like Facebook. So I think it teaches us to be a little bit careful in those assumptions, and to think about things like the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of who is actually connected and who is not. So that's, I think, one thing that we can draw from, is really thinking about the infrastructural question, which also is a really crucial one in Canada, oft debated. That there's also, harm from not being connected to this as well, right? Harm in terms of where you can live and what you can do in your life. So a couple of historical things I might just point to is, we have had moments in the past where public policy makers have realized that disaster requires them to work together and to create technologies that actually are interoperable. And the classic example here is the Titanic disaster. So when the Titanic disaster happened, there were two types of wireless operators. One was from Marconi, which wanted to create a monopoly by having Marconi devices that would only speak to Marconi devices. And then there were other wireless devices as well. So when the wireless operator on the Titanic was sending out distress signals, those could only be heard by some of the ships around, not everyone. So potentially more people could have been rescued had this wireless been more open. So actually a radio conference right afterwards with policymakers mandates interoperability. So that's why you had wireless and then radio sets that could actually speak to each other. So I think, we've had some Titanic moments, and yet we haven't yet come together. So I'm sort of hoping we don't have to have another Titanic moment before we actually really sort of invest in the global platform governance networks that Bob and CG are leading.
So we have a question here that we often talk about these platforms as the new the new public square, the digital square, and we have a question here about but recognizing that at the end of the day they're all private service providers for the most part, and obviously that's the tension that I think is at the heart of today's conversation. So I did want to spend some time as we near the end here, recognizing that we will have folks from a variety of different business lines listening in, program officers, admin folks, and some who will not directly work in this space, right? So how for a public servant who is not directly implicated in kind of the policy work on some of these issues, but is thinking about kind of their business line, any thoughts on kind of how they should approach this digital square and thinking about these issues?
As I'm just looking at the questions, and there's some very good questions here. And one of them was on, these user consent agreements, which, I mean, has anyone ever read them? And how many do you agree to every day? And it's a clear role for standards, just to come up with a standard template that the companies have to follow. And standard setters, it could be, the government could come in and just mandate it, or you could work with the private sector. There's many ways to put them in place, but we do need something, more standardized. And then, one of the, things that I've been thinking about is a lot of the focus right now is regulating the outcomes of the business models, and much less so on regulating the business model itself. And regulating the business model would imply competition policy, for example. Tools need to be used. The danger with just using competition policy is, some of the examples that could be raised, like the EU court case against Microsoft and the US as well. These things take years and years to resolve, and by the time they get resolved, all the bad stuff's already happened. So, but there are tools that can be used by competition authorities, that the interim measures and things like that can be brought in to help deal with it. But we're in this world now where we have to actually do both. We have to regulate the business models more than we have using a set of tools, and then we have to also think about those harmful outcomes. And as we think about the harmful outcomes, not destroy all the good stuff that comes about it too. And these actually are all areas for government action. And there are different approaches within that. The Australia, how they've decided to handle news, versus how the EU is thinking about handling news, and we'll see where Canada lands on that one. But there are examples out there that we can draw upon, as we make our own decisions. And I know you're already doing that, but it's just for the broader audience to know that those that exists. And places like CG, this is where we can add value too, because that's the nature of our work. Civil society can help out, and I think, as Heidi said, we want to bring civil society into these discussions, because they will bring particular perspectives, that we may just not be aware of, given the nature of how we do our work.
Sam?
Yeah. Oh, and kind of going back to your question, and looking at one of the questions here, about online platforms just playing, some of the more traditional roles of infrastructure, like news media libraries, and kind of thinking about them, this tension between public versus private spaces. I think a lot of this stuff, one way of thinking about this stuff comes down to like a very a debate that we've had for a long time in the internet studies, internet policy community more broadly, which is whether or not social media platforms should be considered like news providers, where they have some kind of important role in curating certain kinds of news content, and if that content isn't fair or balanced or equal or representative, that they can then face some kind of like punishment, whether it be like fines or whatnot. And so treating the platforms more as like a news provider. There's a lot of kind of challenges with framing platforms as simply news providers, because they do more than that. Traditionally, this was kind of called like intermediary liability. So platforms have liability from the content that appears on their platform, because take like Google search, for example. The way that Google search works is that it crawls the internet and essentially organizes everything for us, so that when we do searches, it will then deliver content to us, based on previous people's searches, based on keywords on like the various web pages and whatnot. If Google search brought some kind of like hateful or harmful content to the top when a user was making a search, and if they were held liable for that content, Google search as it exists today it wouldn't be there, because they wouldn't be able to crawl and archive the entire web without having content that other people create that might be harmful accidentally make its way up into the search results. And there's a whole industry that tries to like game search engine algorithms to get certain kinds of content to the top of Google search. But this intermediary liability is very important for platforms in some senses, because the content that they are sharing is user generated, and so holding them liable might have other kinds of unintended consequences for like that, even like benefits that we as users get from the platform in terms of having a working awesome search engine. So thinking about this tension between public and private infrastructure, I think moving to debates away from these questions around like intermediary liability and towards what Heidi was talking about earlier in terms of imagining a different kind of public infrastructure, whether it's an internet curated by librarians, or thinking about a whole new model in general, and what that could be. Like, I think that's where we need some creativity and ingenuity, and kind of to disentangle the private from the public a little bit more.
So I'm curious, because if we think of government as a service provider, and obviously governments are big service providers, and I would include municipal and provincial in that as well. Like, I guess my question for this table is, is government doing a good job leading by example? So in terms of being more transparent about the data that is going into decision making. Like, are there examples you can think of? And again, it doesn't have to be federal, but are there levels of government in Canada that are doing a good job of putting their money where their mouth is, and kind of living by some of the principles that you've set out, if we think of them as a service provider?
Yeah, maybe I'd say briefly, I mean, this is a fascinating question, also thinking about COVID, where so much of the debate has been around how much transparency should you have around, for example, COVID cases, how many dashboards, etc. And so we've also seen the downside of privacy, right, of transparency, sorry, when people have been accused of being quote unquote COVID carriers. There was a particularly terrible case in the Atlantic provinces where this also intersected with racialized abuse, because a Black doctor was accused of being the person who had brought in COVID-19, even though it turned out that he wasn't. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind, is that when we're doing this, transparency can be tremendously important, but there are also potential downsides that can be very problematic in terms of leading to stigmatization. So I think figuring out and really sort of working through how one balances that is going to be crucial for governments moving forward. And sometimes that has to do with volume. How do you present aggregates? On and on. Goes back to the points that Bob made about thinking about this 20 years ago. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from how different provinces approach this and what kinds of databases people wanted. Because in some cases, collecting certain types of data really heightened, the ways in which we understood that racialized Canadians were bearing the brunt of COVID-19, but then sometimes that didn't lead to the policy changes one would have needed to actually implement things. So this brings me back to a great piece that Sunha Hong wrote for CG about why transparency isn't enough, right? Just because you have transparency and something, then you've got to be able to do something about it. So just because we know something, it doesn't mean that we enact the policy initiatives that you need to solve it. And I think that's another thing that we should bear in mind. I just want to add one quick thing about the question you asked before, Owen, which is, why should I care if I don't have like internet portfolio? You never know when your portfolio is going to become the hotspot, right? I mean, which public health official, if you'd asked them 3 years ago, would think that they would be, the center of online death threats, abuse, praise in some cases, but also all these other things, conspiracy theories, etc. They couldn't have predicted that, and yet there they were, finding themselves in the center of this storm in all sorts of ways. So I think this is one reason why it's important for anybody, regardless of their portfolio, to understand these dynamics. So you can think about, all right, how do we get information out there? What are the ways it works? What would we do if we were confronted and sort of drawn into the center of one of these storms? So those are some of the reasons why I advocate, no policy portfolio is exempt from potentially being the one that next week gets picked up in some way.
Any thought on either of those questions, Bob?
I fully agree with Heidi. I mean, and it just reinforces the point that you have to bring a multidisciplinary approach to answering these really tricky governance questions. Like, I'm an economist, we have a historian. I'm not sure what everyone's backgrounds are, but you really need the collective voices to come together, because that's the only way we're going to really understand how these technologies are diffusing, and then we can figure out the transparency and the metrics and things like that are essential for governance. It's very tricky. There's no silos anymore. Everything's interconnected, but that creates challenges. I just want to raise one other point too, because I think a lot of the issues with around COVID really did come. There were a lot of questions about the data and how the data could be used for good. Like, for example, we can collect data that really can help us understand how the pandemic is rippling through, depending on the community, different communities. Yet we know it can be used for harm as well. And so we have a statistical agency that's well versed and knows how to do all this stuff. So we have a data trust in Canada. It's called Statistics Canada, that knows how to manage really, really sensitive information. I think people might be surprised about the level of detail that that the statistical agency knows about us, for good reason, because it helps to make it's one input into creating good policies. There is a lot of talk about the role of data trusts, and there are different structures that can be used to manage data. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, but we have expertise in this country to do that. We've got open data. As I say, we've got the directive on use of automated systems, the algorithmic impact assessment tool. There's a whole bunch of things that are being done that our public servants have come up with, and undoubtedly through good consultation that are being used. And we just got to figure out how to do more of that.
Well, I know 90 minutes always seems like a long time, but it has gone quickly. So we have just a couple minutes left. I'll just see if there's anything else you want to throw on the table in a minute or less that you haven't had a chance to raise or put out there. So Heidi, why don't we start with you? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, so one thing I think we can do is, in terms of reframing our mindset, is to remember that for Silicon Valley and other companies, including TikTok, et cetera, their motto is move fast and break things. But the government is sort of the opposite, right? And so one way we could think about this is, what is the role of government in putting in place things like precautionary principles? Bob's example of the algorithmic impact assessment is one of those. Social media companies don't do that. They A/B test on entire nations. It has dramatic consequences if you're an independent media outlet in Serbia and suddenly you wake up one day and nobody's looking at your Facebook page because Facebook decided to A/B test on you. So that's, I think, one way we can think about the role of government is, where does it need to put in place precautionary principles for companies that have moved fast and broken a lot of things potentially?
Sam?
Yeah, I think, I'll add on top of that to say, also maybe more procedural accountability is needed, and rules really about the rules in order to put up those roadblocks and those barriers, so that companies don't just have kind of open highway to go drive and move fast and break things. If there's more procedural accountability and rules kind of about, the kinds of things that can go into terms of service agreements, more rules about the ways that algorithms are audited, so on and so forth, instilling certain kinds of principles around technology design and use. I think that's another kind of good route to slow down the fast moving technology, so that we're not kind of continually growing at a scale without any kind of protection for or thought for the users that the technology will be affecting.
And Bob?
I think we're not in this alone. Every country is dealing with these issues, and encouragingly so is the United States, where these headquarters are, the platforms are headquartered. So we have our domestic issues, and then we have layered on top of it the international dimension. Canada, there's a big opportunity for Canada to lead here. I think we're known as a country with strong values, and values should be determining how the technology is used. So there's a tremendous opportunity for our public service to continue the good work they're doing, and to bring it international in scope where it's really, really needed.
Well, I think that's a good note to end the conversation on, Bob, about values driving the policy. So this has been a real treat for me to moderate this discussion. So I'd like to thank all three panelists, Heidi, Sam, Bob, for making time in your busy schedules to do this. I know it's always a little bit weird in these Zoom calls. We see each other and don't see the multitude that is out there, but I will speak on their behalf and thank you. For those who are listening, I draw your attention to two other events that may be of interest to you. So the Canada School of Public Service Digital Academy will be hosting an event on embracing digital trend disruption this Thursday, May 27th. So if that's of interest, I encourage you to check it out and sign up. And the final event in the New Economy series will be on Thursday, June 10th, and it will look back on the key themes from across the series and do a bit of a wrap up and thinking about their implications for the public service. So on that note, I think it's more or less afternoon from coast to coast now, so I will wish you all a good afternoon, and thanks very much for tuning in. Bye now.